At exactly 6:03 in the evening, the House of Representatives did something it has only done a handful of times in the history of this republic. It declared that the President of the United States was impeached. 229 votes in favor, 206 against. The articles were adopted. The power was formally challenged. Now, on its face, you might think, we've seen this before. This is, after all, the third time in just 5 years that a sitting American president has faced impeachment in the House. But if you look closer, if you look at the architecture of this specific vote, there is a structural difference here that we have never seen before. For the first time in history, a significant bloc of the president's own party did not just express concern. They didn't just issue a sternly worded press release. They crossed the line in numbers that are frankly staggering. 17 Republicans voted yes. Let's put that into perspective. Let's look at the historical sequence so this lands properly. In December 2019, during the first impeachment of Donald Trump, 0 House Republicans voted to impeach, not one. In January 2021, during the second impeachment, 10 Republicans broke ranks. And today, 17. That is the largest number of cross-party votes in any presidential impeachment in the history of the United States. In institutional terms, that is not noise. That is not a fringe element. That is a fracture. That is nearly 1 in 10 members of the Republican conference deciding that the president's conduct has moved beyond the pale. And here's the thing you need to understand about why they did it. This wasn't about a personal scandal. It wasn't about a foreign policy dispute or a controversial tweet. The justification those 17 Republicans offered was constitutional. They argued that when a president publicly refuses to comply with a ruling of the Supreme Court of the United States, Congress doesn't just have the option to respond, it has a duty. This isn't about personality, it's about institutional defiance. We heard from Representative Adam Kinzinger, who framed it bluntly. He said his oath was to the Constitution, not to an individual. He argued that if a president ignores a Supreme Court ruling, we are no longer talking about executive disagreement. We are talking about something much closer to authoritarian behavior. Representative Liz Cheney reinforced that hierarchy, reminding the chamber that if a president rejects judicial authority, he is rejecting the constitutional order itself. So, the House has acted. The fracture is real, and at 6:15 p.m., just 12 minutes after that gavel fell, the president responded. And his response? It has set the stage for an institutional standoff unlike anything we have seen since the founding of this country. At 6:15 in the evening, just 12 minutes after the House clerk recorded that historic vote, the President of the United States responded. And he didn't do it through a formal legal filing or a White House press briefing. He did it on social media. And what he said wasn't just a defense of his actions, it was a rejection of the system itself. He called the impeachment illegitimate. He called it void. He argued that Congress has no authority to remove a president for defending executive power against what he described as judicial overreach. But then he went a step further. He stated plainly that he would not recognize the impeachment. He said he would not participate in any Senate trial. He said he remains the president and will continue to execute the duties of the office regardless of what happens on the Senate floor. Pause there. Think about what that means. A president of the United States declaring that he does not recognize a constitutional proceeding initiated by the House of Representatives. That isn't just a disagreement over policy. That is an escalation from a political dispute into a full-scale institutional standoff. The Senate, however, did not wait for the president's permission. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer moved almost instantly, announcing that the Senate would fulfill its constitutional duty to hold a trial. He confirmed that Chief Justice John Roberts would preside, as the Constitution requires when a president is on trial. Evidence would be presented, witnesses would be heard, and the trial? It's expected to begin this coming Monday. But then there's the other side of the aisle. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell issued a statement that was, let's call it, measured. He acknowledged profound concerns about the president's defiance of the Supreme Court. He noted that impeachment is a grave action, but he conspicuously did not say how he would vote. He said senators must determine if the conduct rises to the level of removal. That uncertainty, that isn't a small thing. In Washington, that kind of ambiguity isn't just a maybe, it's leverage. By 7:23 p.m., the third branch of government entered the chat. Chief Justice John Roberts confirmed he had been formally notified and that he would preside over the trial. So step back and look at the board as it stands tonight. The House has acted. The president has rejected the action, the Senate is preparing the chamber, and the Chief Justice is stepping into the chair reserved for moments of maximum national tension. This is where the focus shifts. It shifts away from the rhetoric, away from the social media posts, and toward the cold, hard architecture of American power. Because from here on out, the next calculation is not rhetorical. It is not about who has the loudest voice or the most followers. From here on out, it is purely mathematical. Now, here is the thing. We are moving from the theater of the House to the arena of the Senate. And in the Senate, the rules of the game change entirely. Under the Constitution, the House impeaches, but the Senate tries. And the bar for conviction? It isn't a simple majority. It isn't even a strong majority. It is a super majority, 67 out of 100. This is the part of the architecture designed by the founders to make removal rare, deliberate, and structurally difficult. This is where the confrontation stops being symbolic and becomes cold, hard math. Let's look at the board. The current Senate alignment is simple on paper. 51 seats are held by Democrats and the independents who caucus with them. 49 seats are held by Republicans. If every single Democrat and aligned independent votes to convict, and that is a big if, but a likely one, then 16 Republicans must join them to reach that magic number of 67. 16. That number is now the fulcrum upon which the entire American constitutional system is balancing tonight. Now, you might think 16 is an impossible mountain to climb in this partisan age, but look at what has already happened before the trial even begins. 12 Republican senators have already publicly rejected the president's claim of sweeping emergency powers. And I want to say their names, because in moments like this, institutions are carried by individuals. Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, Bill Cassidy, Ben Sasse, Richard Burr, Pat Toomey, Rob Portman, Tom Tillis, Shelley Moore Capito, Joni Ernst. That is 12. If, and it is still a massive if, all 12 of those senators vote to convict, the count stands at 63. That means the entire fate of the presidency, the entire question of whether a president can ignore the Supreme Court and get away with it, comes down to just 4 more people. And we are already seeing the signals. We are seeing what we call permission structures being built inside the GOP caucus. We're watching Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, who says the court must be respected. We're watching Todd Young of Indiana, who is calling for compliance with judicial orders. We're watching John Thune, the number 2 Republican in the Senate, who has expressed grave concern about a constitutional crisis. Let me say this clearly because it is something we haven't been able to say in any previous impeachment in our lifetimes. A conviction is no longer just a progressive pipe dream. It is no longer just a rhetorical what if. Because of the way these specific 16 individuals are moving, a conviction, the actual removal of the President of the United States, has become arithmetically possible. The difference between the president's survival and his removal may now come down to just 4 human beings. But, as we know, numbers alone don't decide this. Pressure does. And in part 4, we're going to look at the 3 scenarios, the 3 paths this country could take by this time next week. But here is the thing. Numbers alone do not decide the fate of a presidency. Math is the framework, but pressure is the fuel. Every one of those senators, those 16 Republicans we just talked about, they are currently living inside a pressure cooker. They are being compressed by primary threats, by donor networks, by media ecosystems that are demanding absolute party fealty. And on the other side, they are feeling the weight of the history books. And that is where the scenario matrix emerges. Because when this trial concludes, and it is expected to move fast, we are going to land in one of 3 very different Americas. Scenario 1. The Senate convicts. With 67 votes or more, the president is removed from office. Power passes immediately to the vice president under the constitutional line of succession. This would mark the most consequential assertion of congressional authority over the executive branch in the history of the modern world. It would send a definitive message. No one, not even the president, is above the law. Scenario 2. Conviction fails, but it's close. We're talking about 63 to 66 votes in favor. In this scenario, the president survives, but he is fundamentally broken. He remains in office, but he is zombie-like in terms of political capital. The institutional message becomes dangerously ambiguous. It says that defying the Supreme Court is wrong, maybe even dangerous, but not quite enough to get you fired. It's accountability attempted, but not achieved. Scenario 3. Conviction fails decisively. Fewer than 60 votes to convict. In this version of reality, the president declares total vindication. He becomes emboldened, and the lesson for every future president from either party becomes clear. You can openly defy the Supreme Court and survive as long as your party closes its ranks around you. Now, as we watch this trial unfold starting Monday, there are very specific indicators that will tell us which of these 3 paths we are on. First, watch the president's behavior. Does he rescind the emergency order? Does he announce compliance with the Supreme Court before the trial starts? If he does, he might give those senators a permission structure to vote for acquittal, arguing the crisis is over. But if he stays defiant, if he continues to say he doesn't recognize the court or the Congress, then the defiance remains active. And second, watch for the early movers. Do any Republican senators publicly commit to guilty before the trial even concludes? In a caucus, one person standing up gives the person next to them the cover to do the same. This isn't theater. This is a fluid, high-stakes structural stress test. And in Part 5, we're going to look at the history that brought us here and why this specific charge is different from every other impeachment in American history. To understand exactly how unusual and, frankly, how precarious this moment is, you have to look backward. Because presidential impeachments in this country almost never end in removal. They are designed to be difficult, and history bears that out. In 1868, Andrew Johnson survived by a single vote. The system strained, but it held. In 1999, Bill Clinton's conviction was never even within reach. In 2020, during Donald Trump's first impeachment, only 1 Republican voted to convict. In 2021, 7 Republicans supported conviction, still 10 votes short of the finish line. The pattern is unmistakable. The partisan gravity of the American system usually pulls everyone back to their corners, and the president stays in office. But here is the thing. This case, this specific moment in 2026, it introduces an entirely different axis. This charge is not centered on personal misconduct. It's not about foreign entanglements or perjury. It is centered on a president declaring, out loud and in public that he is not bound by a ruling of the Supreme Court of the United States. And that, my friends, is where the narrative shifts from a political fight to a full-blown institutional stress test. Constitutional scholars have long pointed out a fundamental glitch in our system. The judiciary lacks an army. It has no enforcement power of its own. It doesn't have a police force to make its rulings stick. The Supreme Court relies entirely on the voluntary compliance of the executive branch. So, if the president simply says no, if the branch that controls the literal power of the state refuses to acknowledge the branch that interprets the law, then the system has only one tool left in the toolbox, just one, and that tool is impeachment. That is why this trial starting Monday is about so much more than one man or one administration. It is a referendum on whether the authority of the Supreme Court is binding or merely advisory when it gets in the way of a president's will. If 16 Republican senators conclude that party loyalty outweighs judicial supremacy, the consequences will not end with this vote. Because if the court's rulings can be disregarded without consequence, then the checks and balances we all learned about in middle school aren't actually checks at all. They're just suggestions. And as we move into Part 6, we have to look at the one man who is caught in the middle of it all, and the final question that will determine the future of the American experiment. The House vote, 229 to 206, now stands as the most bipartisan presidential impeachment in the history of this country. And while it's easy to get lost in the noise, those 17 Republicans who crossed over, they are not a footnote. They are a political marker. For the first time, a meaningful bloc within a president's own party has stood up and declared that openly defying the Supreme Court is an unacceptable constitutional boundary. That line matters because once members of your own party acknowledge a breach of judicial authority, the argument is no longer just partisan. It becomes institutional. It signals that the guardrails are still there, even if they are under immense strain. But now, the real test moves across the hall. The Senate is walking into this trial carrying two simultaneous, crushing pressures. The first is political. Senators face voters. They face primary challenges. They face a donor network and an activist base that can punish them for even a hint of disloyalty. That pressure is immediate. It is personal. It is loud. The second is constitutional. The oath a senator takes in an impeachment trial is different. It's not an oath to a party or a platform. It is a specific oath to do impartial justice according to the Constitution. They are being asked to weigh the supremacy of the law against the stability of their party alignment. And then there is Mitch McConnell. The minority leader has not committed. He has expressed concern, but he has not chosen a side. And in the world of the Senate, that ambiguity is a form of power. McConnell's position has historically shaped the boundaries of what is possible for the Republican conference. If he moves toward conviction, the center of gravity shifts. If he resists, the wall holds. One individual, one pivotal decision. And presiding over it all, Chief Justice John Roberts. He will sit in that chair not as a political actor, but as a constitutional referee. And think about the visual weight of that. He embodies the very branch of government whose authority is being challenged. The court has ruled, the president has resisted. Now, the Chief Justice oversees the chamber that decides if that resistance is a fireable offense. Let me frame this as plainly as I can. The core question next week is not simply whether one man keeps his job. The question is whether a Supreme Court ruling remains binding when it is met with executive refusal and partisan protection. American history has seen moments where the system bends but doesn't break. Andrew Johnson survived by one vote. Bill Clinton survived comfortably. Donald Trump survived twice. Each time, the system absorbed the shock. But this is different. This centers on the authority of the law itself. If a president can disregard the highest court in the land without being removed, then future presidents, of any party, will see that boundary as a suggestion, not a wall. They will test it again, not because of ideology, but because the precedent says they can. 100 senators will cast their votes within a week. Their decision will not just close a trial, it will rewrite the rules for the next chapter of American democracy. Because if the branch designed to enforce accountability, the Congress, hesitates when judicial authority is directly challenged, then we have to ask ourselves, what exactly remains as the final safeguard of our constitutional order? That is the tension. That is the stakes. And we will be watching every minute of it.